We like to believe that we are the architects of our own safety. We tell ourselves that if we follow the unwritten rules, if we double-check the locks at night, if we scan our bank statements for irregularities, if we teach our children to be wary of strangers, then the chaos of the world will simply pass us by, like a storm moving around a mountain. We build our lives out of routine. We build comfort out of habit. And we convince ourselves that danger is loud, that it has a face we can recognize from a distance, that it announces itself with a scream or a shattered window. But what if it doesn't? What if the greatest danger doesn't force its way in with a crowbar, but waits patiently on the porch to be invited? What if the thing that eventually breaks you first appears as the answer to a quiet prayer you've been whispering to the ceiling for years? This is not a story about violence. It is a story about trust, about the crushing weight of loneliness, and about how the most beautiful human instinct, the desire to be known, can become a weapon in the hands of a master. Let's go to Ridgeland, Ohio. It was late October, the time of year when the Midwest sky lowers itself like a heavy gray ceiling. The air was sharp and metallic, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and makes you walk faster, shoulders hunched, eager to get behind a closed door. The wind coming off the lake cut through wool coats and scarves without mercy. For most people in Ridgeland, this weather was just a seasonal inconvenience. For 32-year-old Sarah Miller, it was a mirror. Sarah was the manager of Lumiere, the most exclusive jewelry boutique on Main Street. From the outside, her life looked as polished and secure as the displays she curated. She was the woman with the keys. She was the gatekeeper. She was the woman trusted with glass cases full of flawless diamonds, vintage Patek Philippe watches, and engagement rings that cost more than most people's cars. But Sarah lived her life behind the glass. She stood behind the counter and watched life happen to other people. She watched young couples choosing rings with nervous electric smiles, their hands trembling as they touched. She watched husbands quietly buying apology gifts, their eyes full of regret. She saw milestones, secrets, promises, and vanity, all passing through her hands, yet remaining separated from her by a reinforced invisible barrier. Sarah was the observer. She was the curator of other people's happiness, never the one being chosen. Away from the boutique, the glamour evaporated. Her life was stripped down to a grueling, colorless efficiency. She was a single mother of 2 young daughters, Emily and Chloe. Her days were a relay race against exhaustion. Wake up, pack lunches, finding missing socks. School drop-off, drive to work, inventory checks, security logs, customer service smile, school pickup, dinner, homework battles, bath time, collapse. Her friends, the few she still had time to see, called her strong. They called her a supermom. But Sarah didn't feel strong. She felt porous. She felt like a structure that was slowly eroding from the inside out. It had been years since anyone had asked her how her day was, and actually waited for the answer. Years since she had felt chosen, or seen, or held with intention. She wasn't lonely in the dramatic, weeping sense. She was lonely in the quiet, slow way that wears you down like water dripping on stone. And loneliness, left untreated, is dangerous. It creates a hunger, and hunger makes you look at poison and see a feast. It started on a Tuesday. Tuesdays were always the quietest days at Lumiere. The rain was tapping a soft, rhythmic code against the display windows, and the store hummed with the sterile buzz of high-end halogen lights. Sarah was rearranging a velvet tray of sapphires, moving them millimeter by millimeter to catch the light, when the bell above the door chimed. Ding! The man who walked in didn't move like a customer. Customers hesitate. They glance at price tags with widened eyes. They shift their weight, uncomfortable in the hush of the luxury space. This man didn't hesitate. He moved with a calm, fluid confidence, as if he owned the space he occupied. He wore a navy wool suit that fit him with architectural precision. No tie, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. His hair was touched with distinguished gray at the temples, and his eyes were an unsettlingly clear shade of blue, focused, observant, intentional. Sarah looked up, her customer service smile automatically clicking into place. "Good morning. Can I help you find something specific today?" He didn't look at the jewelry. He didn't look at the sapphires or the diamonds. He looked at her. It wasn't a predatory look. It wasn't inappropriate. It was simply direct. He held her gaze just long enough to make the air in the room change pressure, just long enough to make her feel visible. "I'm not shopping," he said. His voice was a rich baritone, warm against the cool air of the store. "Not yet, anyway. I'm new in town, visiting from Chicago for a development project. Someone warned me the coffee shop next door is a crime against humanity. I was hoping for a local recommendation." Then he smiled. It was a slow, crooked smile that reached his eyes. Where can a man get a decent vanilla oat latte around here? It was harmless, it was ordinary, and it was strangely disarming. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, try the roasted bean. It's 2 blocks down. Take a left at the bank. They roast their own." 2 blocks down. "Left at the bank," he repeated, as if memorizing a state secret. "Thank you." He turned and left. The bell chimed again. Sarah exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. She went back to the sapphires. She assumed that was the end of it. 20 minutes later, the bell rang again. Ding! The man was back. This time he was shaking rain off an umbrella. In his hands he held 2 paper cups. He walked straight to the counter and placed one gently in front of Sarah. "Vanilla oat latte," he said. "Extra foam." The barista said that's the standard for excellence. Sarah stared at the cup. "You didn't have to do that." "It felt wrong to drink alone," he said simply. "I'm Julian." From that moment on, Julian didn't just enter the store. He entered the architecture of her life. He didn't rush. That was his genius. If he had asked for her number that first day, she would have said no. If he had been aggressive, she would have retreated behind her glass barrier. But Julian was patient. He was water, finding the cracks. He started stopping by a few times a week, never for long, just enough to become a highlight in the gray monotony of her routine. He talked about his work as a real estate developer. He spoke with genuine passion about restoring old, broken-down buildings in the city center. He talked about seeing the potential in things that others have discarded. When he spoke about transformation, about making broken things whole again, he always seemed to be looking directly at Sarah. He was a listener, an aggressive, intense listener. He remembered details she didn't even realize she had shared. Her daughters' names, Emily and Chloe. The specific day her ex-husband missed his alimony payments. The way her voice dropped an octave when she talked about being tired. He never pushed. He never crossed a physical line. Instead, he waited. One evening, a month later, he walked her to her car after the store closed. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the windshields. Sarah leaned against her car, exhausted after a 12-hour shift involving a difficult inventory audit. She let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 5 years. Julian looked at her. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her, "It gets better." He asked a question that unraveled her completely. "Sarah," he said softly, "who takes care of you?" The silence that followed was deafening. No one had asked her that in years. The question hit her like a physical blow to the chest. It exposed the vast, arid desert of her emotional life. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to hide them, turning away, but Julian reached out and gently touched her gloved hand. "That's what I thought," he whispered. And just like that, a door she didn't realize was locked quietly clicked open. By December, Sarah wasn't just falling in love. She was leaning. She was leaning on his good morning messages to start her day. She was leaning on the sound of his voice to soften the sharp edges of her nights. She was leaning on the intoxicating idea that someone remarkable, had finally chosen her. He never demanded her attention. He simply became part of the structure of her existence. And when something becomes structural, you stop questioning it. You just expect it to hold the roof up. There were small red flags, tiny cracks in the facade that, in hindsight, should have terrified her. Julian preferred to pay in cash, always. He laughed it off as a personal quirk, telling a story about a messy identity theft incident years ago in Chicago. "I like to stay off the grid where I can," he'd say with a charming wink. It sounded reasonable, responsible even. He never invited her to where he was staying. He said the corporate housing the investors provided was sterile and cold. "I'd rather be with you," he said, "in the real world, in your world." Sarah didn't see secrecy. She saw boundaries. She saw a man who prioritized her comfort over his own. Julian asked questions, so many questions. Not the kind that felt intrusive, the kind that felt interested. He asked about the boutique because he admired her responsibility. "How do you handle the alarm codes? Do you have to log every item individually? How does the safe work on the time lock? It must be so stressful carrying those keys." Sarah talked. She talked because she trusted him, because she believed that sharing the details of her life was the same thing as intimacy. She didn't think she was revealing security protocols. She thought she was letting someone into her burden. And each answer, each detail, was quietly filed away, not in a heart, but in a ledger. Then, everything shifted. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was a subtle change in the weather. Julian grew distracted. His text messages came slower. His smile seemed thinner, strained. One evening, sitting in her car, the heater blasting against the winter chill, he looked exhausted in a way she had never seen before. He stared at the dashboard, his hands gripping his knees. "Julian?" Sarah asked, touching his arm. "What is it?" When he looked at her, his eyes were wet. He told her he was in trouble. He spun a story that was a masterpiece of vagueness and urgency. A situation he hadn't seen coming. A silent investor in the development project had pulled out, freezing the accounts. There was a legal complication, a dispute that had locked his access to his own funds. He explained it carefully, calmly, just enough detail to make it sound complex and real, but not enough to invite scrutiny. "It's temporary," he said, his voice cracking. "It's a matter of liquidity. I just need to bridge the gap for 48 hours. If I don't, the project collapses, the investors walk, and everything I've built, everything I'm building for us, disappears." He didn't ask her for money. He knew she didn't have enough to matter. He knew she was a single mom living paycheck to paycheck. He let the silence hang there. He let the weight of his fear settle into her chest until it became her fear. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, putting his head in his hands. Sarah felt panic rising. She couldn't lose him. He was the only bright thing in her life. "How can I help?" she asked. Julian looked up. He hesitated. He looked conflicted, as if the very thought pained him. "There is one way," he said slowly, "but I can't ask you to do it." He framed it as a loan, a collateral loan. He knew the inventory schedules. He knew the shipment of loose diamonds that had arrived that morning, the ones that wouldn't be cataloged and put into the system until Friday. "If I could just hold them," he said, "as collateral for a private bridge loan, just for 24 hours. They never have to leave the city. I get the funds released. I return the stones to you before the Friday audit. No one knows. No one gets hurt." He took her hands. His grip was warm, desperate. "Sarah, I'm talking about our future. I'm talking about the house I want to buy for you and the girls. I'm talking about never having to stand behind that glass again." He didn't make it sound like a crime. He didn't make it sound like a betrayal of her values. He made it sound like an act of loyalty, an act of love. And slowly, quietly, the line between right and necessary began to blur. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around her. Every instinct she had, the mother's instinct, the manager's instinct, was screaming at her that this was wrong. But then she thought of the loneliness. She thought of the years of being invisible. She thought of Julian's eyes filled with tears. Who takes care of you, Sarah? By morning, the decision felt less like a choice and more like a fever dream. The night everything changed arrived with a winter storm. The snow was heavy, blinding, turning the streets of Ridgeland into a blurred gray tunnel. Sarah moved through the final hours of her shift on autopilot. She smiled at customers, but she couldn't hear what they were saying. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When the store finally emptied, silence settled in. Heavy, absolute. Sarah stood alone behind the counter. The safe was open. She paused. For a brief second, she considered closing it, walking away, calling him and saying no. But she was already too far out on the ice. Her hands shook as she reached in. She bypassed the trays of rings. She went for the velvet pouch in the back, the loose stones, the ones that didn't technically exist in the system yet. She put the pouch in her purse. She wasn't just stealing diamonds. She was stealing her own peace of mind. She was crossing a threshold from which there is no return. She locked the store. She set the alarm. She walked out into the storm. The alley behind the store was empty, white, and freezing. A dark sedan waited at the curb, its headlights cut, the engine idling softly. Sarah got in. The warmth of the car hit her, but it didn't stop the shivering deep inside her spine. Julian was in the driver's seat. He looked tense. She didn't say a word. She couldn't speak. She reached into her purse and pulled out the velvet pouch. She handed it to him. For a moment, time stopped. Julian took the pouch. He opened it. He looked at the stones glittering in the dim dashboard light. And then Sarah saw it. It was subtle, a flicker, a micro-expression. She was looking for relief in his face. She was looking for gratitude. She was looking for love. She didn't see any of those things. She saw calculation. She saw a man assessing the value of an asset. The warmth left his eyes, replaced by a cold, sharp satisfaction. It lasted only a second before he masked it, turning back to her with that familiar, charming smile. "You did the right thing," he said softly, tucking the pouch into his jacket pocket. "You saved us, Sarah." He kissed her, but the kiss felt different. It felt hollow. It felt like a transaction being sealed. "Go home," he said. "Sleep. I'll fix this. I'll meet you at the coffee shop tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. I'll have the stones back, and this nightmare will be over." Sarah got out of the car. She stood in the snow, watching his taillights fade into the whiteout. She felt a sudden, sickening emptiness in her stomach. She didn't know it yet, but she had just watched the last piece of her life drive away. Thursday morning, 8 a.m. Sarah sat at a corner table in the Roasted Bean. She had been there since 7:30. She was wearing her coat, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she couldn't drink. She told herself not to panic. The weather is bad. Traffic is slow. He's just late. 8:15. 8:30. 9 o'clock. She called him. The line rang once, then a click, then the mechanical voice. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. The blood drained from her face. She tried again and again. No longer in service. This wasn't a delay. This was a disconnection. She ran out of the coffee shop. She got in her car and drove. She drove like a madwoman to the site Julian had spoken about so often, the old textile mill he was supposedly converting into lofts, the place where their future was being built. She found it. It was an empty lot, chain-link fence, snowdrifts, a for sale sign that looked like it had been there for a decade. No construction equipment, no scaffolding, no Julian. It was just a ruin. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, a scream building in her throat that wouldn't come out. She drove one more place. The address he had mentioned once, casually, early on. A townhouse on Elm Street. She pounded on the door. An elderly woman answered, looking frightened. "Julian?" the woman asked, confused. "I've lived here for 30 years, dear. There's no Julian here." The truth didn't arrive gently. It didn't come in waves. It crashed down on her like a collapsing building. There was no project. There was no legal trouble. There was no future. There had never even been a Julian. Sarah sank down onto the stranger's porch steps, the snow soaking into her coat. The kindness, the patience, the way he listened to her talk about her daughters, the way he asked, "Who takes care of you?" It wasn't love. It was research. He hadn't been courting her. He had been grooming her. He had identified the weak link in the security chain, her loneliness, and he had exploited it with surgical precision. Sarah didn't run. She didn't try to hide. She did the only thing she had left. She went to the police station. The interrogation room was small, smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Sarah sat across from a detective, her face pale, her eyes dead. She told them everything. She confessed to taking the diamonds. She confessed to handing them over. She told the story of the romance, and as she spoke the words aloud, they sounded ridiculous. They sounded like a fairy tale a child would believe. She hated herself with every sentence. The detective listened quietly. He didn't look surprised. When she finished, he opened a file folder and slid a photograph across the metal table. "Is this him?" Sarah looked. It was the same face, but stripped of the charm, the eyes looked cold, predatory. "That's not Julian," the detective said gently. "That's Marcus Thorne. We've been tracking him across 3 states." He explained the pattern. Marcus Thorne targeted women in positions of trust: bank managers, archivists, jewelry store managers. He looked for women who were responsible, hardworking, and lonely. "He doesn't break in," the detective said. "He waits to be invited." Because Sarah cooperated, because she turned herself in before the theft was even discovered, and because her testimony was crucial to the multi-state investigation, the consequences were tempered. But they were still consequences. Sarah lost her job. She was placed on probation. She had to pay restitution that would take her years to earn back. But the real cost wasn't financial. It was the time lost, the shame of looking her daughters in the eye and knowing she had risked their stability for a phantom. Years have passed now. Sarah works in a library. It's quiet. There are no high-stakes items, no diamonds, no glass cases protecting millions, just books. She lives a smaller life, a quieter life. She checks her locks every night, then she checks them again. When a stranger smiles at her in the grocery store, she doesn't smile back. She searches their face for intention. She wonders what they want. When kindness appears too easily, she wonders what it is hiding. Trust, once broken that deeply, doesn't grow back straight. It grows back twisted, guarded, like scar tissue. We like to believe that monsters look like monsters, that danger has a sound. But Sarah knows the truth. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't a scream in the night. It is the patience of a predator who waits for you to say yes. It is the voice that asks, "Who takes care of you?" And the terrible, beautiful, human desire to believe the answer is me.